This lesson is about how scientists use fossil evidence to determine possible relationships between species and to help explain why some species alive today look similar to other species that have gone extinct in the past. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the difference between homologous and analogous structures and be able to give examples of each. Understand how homologous structures help to determine possible relationships among species. Define and give examples of vestigial features. Understand how vestigial features can provide evidence for evolutionary relationships, and understand how some extinct species are similar to species living on Earth today. So, our discussion today is going to take us back to Darwin's ideas. Darwin expanded on his theory of natural selection to propose the concept of descent with modification. This is the idea that each living species on Earth has descended with changes from other species over time. So, in essence, species that are alive today have ancestor species that used to live on this Earth. Due to natural selection, some of the traits of those ancestor species died out, and some of them got passed on. Darwin proposed that over a long period of time, those species underwent so many changes that they became a new species. It is descent with modification that gets the term we are more familiar with, and a concept you will learn more about in biology, evolution. Darwin even went so far as to propose common descent, that all living organisms are related to one another. Some species would, of course, be more closely related to certain species than others. This was and still is a very controversial idea. It is an idea that has some evidence to support it, and we will talk about the types of evidence that scientists use, but it is not an idea that has been proven. Scientists use 5 main types of evidence to try to support the idea of descent with modification. The fossil record, which you have been exploring and we will talk about briefly, homologous body structures, and vestigial organs, we'll learn what both of those concepts are, embryology, which is how embryos develop, and biochemical evidence, which is generally in the form of looking at DNA relationships among species. We are not going to talk much about the last 2 on this list, and we'll focus on the first 3. If it is a topic that interests you, though, there's a lot of information available about how embryology and DNA are being used to determine relationships among species. So, you have been learning about the fossil record. Remember, the principle of superposition is the idea that the oldest rock layers, and therefore the oldest fossils, are found deeper than the newer rocks and fossils. We can use these rock layers to determine eons and eras in Earth's history, and also to determine which species could have come first in a possible evolutionary line. They can also use rock layers and fossil evidence to show how continents used to be arranged on the Earth, and how they have changed over time. Following the patterns of where fossils have been found can give us an idea of where these species lived in the past, and whether they could have had descendants in a particular region of the world. The second major type of evidence that scientists use is homologous body structures. Take a look at the picture on the right. What do you notice about the bones in the human arm, the whale flipper, the bat wing, and the bird wing? How are they the same? How are they different? You should notice that they all have about the same number of bones and the same placement of those bones. They all have 5 fingers, for example. But the size and shape of the bones is different. The finger bones in the bat are long and thin, while the whale's are short and thick. We call these homologous body structures. Remember that the prefix homo means the same. These are structures that have similar anatomy, even though they are part of a different species. The hypothesis is that they are similar because they possibly share a common ancestor. That one species in the past had bones like these, and that species changed over time to give rise to many different species. The bones may have changed in shape and size to better fit the environment that the species lived in. For instance, the bat needs thin bones to fly, but the whale needs thick bones to push through the water. The overall anatomy, however, stayed the same. So when we consider that prefix homo in homology, it has a dual meaning. The anatomy is the same, and the species potentially have the same ancestor. Here's another diagram showing how an ancient fish could have possibly been the common ancestor to turtles, alligators, birds, and mammals. The bones in that fish could have changed slightly over time to give rise to these different types of species and to allow them to function in different habitats. Sometimes species have features that serve a similar purpose, but on closer inspection, they do not have the same anatomy, the same structure. These are called analogous structures. One example of these structures is the butterfly wing and the bird wing. While they both fulfill the function of flying, they have very different compositions. The bird wing is made of bones and feathers, while the butterfly wing is thin and membranous. Because of this difference, it can be concluded that the wing feature in birds and butterflies did not come from a common ancestor, but arose separately due to a similar need or ecological role to fill. Vestigial structures are another piece of evidence that scientists use to determine how closely a species is related to another species. Humans have a very pronounced pelvic girdle, which is our hip region. Our hips attach directly to our femur bones, which are our legs, and allow us to be able to walk and run. Take a look at the python skeleton on the left. It too has a pelvic girdle and short hind limbs. But why? Snakes don't walk. So how do you explain the presence of this structure? The bones in the snake and the bones in this whale are what are called vestigial organs or vestigial structures. They are structures that no longer serve a purpose, but are left over from a species that once needed them. Scientists use vestigial structures as evidence for descent with modification, that at one point in time, a species needed hind limbs to walk. But over time, the environment changed and traits got passed down and the species no longer needed that feature. So the structure got smaller and smaller over time. Just like the python, the whale also has a vestigial pelvis and femur. Because of this and some other features, scientists believe that the ancestor of the whale used to walk on land, that it used to run and need a pelvis and a femur. The appendix in humans is also thought to be a vestigial feature. Our ancestors used to eat a lot of roughage, which would be plants with tough fibers that our body had a hard time breaking down. The appendix housed bacteria and chemicals that helped us to digest these tough plants. However, over time, the human diet changed, and we no longer eat these types of plants, and the appendix has become unnecessary to our survival. It is a leftover from our ancestors, a vestigial feature. Based on fossil records, homologous structures, vestigial organs, embryology, and DNA, scientists can hypothesize how closely related one species is to another. They use charts like this one, called cladograms, to show the relationships between species. The closer you are on the cladogram to another species, the more closely you are related to that species. Realize that this particular diagram does not list every species on Earth, but which species on this diagram would be the most closely related to humans. The whale. Yes, the whale is the closest to the human on the diagram, and so would be the most closely related species. Cladograms also show where there is a common ancestor. At some point, you will have the opportunity to make a cladogram in class. Where two lines intersect represents a species that could have been a common ancestor. Here would be a common ancestor to humans and whales. To be a common ancestor, it would have to share characteristics between the two species. So the common ancestor of the whales would have to have been a mammal, which means it has a backbone and gives live birth. Where this arrow is pointing would be a common ancestor between the Saurischian dinosaurs and birds. Scientists believe that this species, the Archaeopteryx, is one of those links between dinosaurs and birds. The picture on the left shows a fossil of Archaeopteryx, and the picture on the right is a diagram of what the Archaeopteryx might have looked like. The Archaeopteryx is believed to have feathers and wings like a bird, making it a likely ancestor. Scientists use clues like fossils and homology to determine possible relationships among species, and to explain how species alive today could be similar to species that used to live on the Earth but have become extinct. So how well did you do with our learning goals? On the note taker for this lesson, make sure you answer these questions to review the information and solidify your understanding. Explain the difference between homologous and analogous structures and give an example of each. How do homologous structures help to determine possible relationships among species? Define and give an example of a vestigial feature. How do vestigial features provide evidence for relationships among species? And how can an extinct species be similar to a species living on Earth today? Give an example of this.